It's the next part of our series with the lead webinars. I think we've got massive numbers logged in this last couple of weeks, and hopefully we've a couple more planned in the coming weeks. So I'd like to thank Keane. I'm just going to hand over here to Colin Kelly. He's going to say a few words before we hand it over to Keane. So thanks very much for everyone logging in, and we'll send a recording of the webinar tomorrow if it breaks down at any stage. Thank you.
Hi, thanks Shane. Yeah, listen, thanks to everyone logging in. We're very lucky with the quality of people we've had for the last 3 weeks. This is the last series, and by no means least, we're blessed to have a guy Keane's ability. He's the current Cork senior coach. He's the ex-manager to there, but probably, you know, the best achievement, I suppose, from my point of view, looking at it, is the fact that he coached Kerry to win the 2014 All-Ireland. Not many coaches outside of Dublin have done that in the recent past, so we're blessed to have him. I'm sure it'll be very enjoyable. So just hand it over to Keane now. Off you go, buddy.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Shane. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and share the next hour or so, whatever it takes, between a brief presentation that I'll give, just essentially focusing on some of my own thoughts and beliefs on the title that myself and Colin and Shane discussed in recent weeks. And that title is The Principles of Defence in Gaelic Games. And just from the outset to state, it's by no means exclusive. Principles by their very nature are quite personal. They are quite close to the individual. So that's not to say that the 100 to 150 people here this evening will not have different principles, different belief systems, different philosophies. But I wanted to keep this sufficiently broad, I guess, and fundamental, because I do think we are in danger in the modern game, and indeed in modern coaching, of overcomplicating things. So there's 3 key principles I will share with you tonight. But just before we do get there, I just wanted to state that the principles of defence in Gaelic games specifically can relate to football, can relate to hurling, can relate to camogie, ladies football, and indeed extend outside of Gaelic games into any sport for that nature, but particularly invasion games, based on what I will be discussing tonight. So the reason I chose that picture on top actually is that goes back to 2006, which was my first year coaching intercounty with Limerick back in the day with Mickey Ned. And we were beaten that year in the Division 2. That's back in the day when it was Division 1A and 1B and 2A and 2B. And we were in 2A or B at the time. And we played Louth. We, being Limerick at the time, played Louth in a league semi-final. Ironically, in St. Conleth's Park in Newbridge, which is my hometown. But Louth were the rightful winners that day, yourselves. And you went on and bet Donegal in a replay. So quite an amazing achievement at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you went on and won the Tommy Murphy Cup that year. So that's the reason behind that picture for sure. But just moving on to the focus of tonight, which indeed is specifically on principles and as distinct from tactics. And I don't want to get bogged down in talking about tactics tonight, but I think it's important sometimes to distinguish between the two. So at the back end of this short presentation, we might spend some time just talking about tactics, what they are, and potentially how they can be coached and delivered. But just to get it going, principles can mean different things to different people. So maybe for the next minute or so, 30 seconds to 60 seconds, can anybody just feed into the chat box there? When you think of principles, when you hear the term principles, be it in coaching, be it in life in general, just type in very quickly there, you know, what that means to you, because I think it is interesting to get a view of the breadth of thoughts and understandings of what this key term is. So don't be shy there. 1 or 2 people kick it off. Normally I find when 1 or 2 people kick it off very quickly, you know, 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 people follow. So principles, what are principles to you? And I'll just flick across here. Okay, thanks, Killian. So organization. Brian has come in. He's mentioned beliefs. Very good. Anything else on top of organization and beliefs? Okay, Ollie speaks about basics or fundamentals. And I do like that term because obviously I really want to keep it simple here tonight, especially if the focus is on youth games. Okay, Mr. Creeley, foundation, Gerard, beliefs. And Madine, minimize fouls. Thomas, way of thinking, behaving, very good. Some really good points coming in now. Ideals you want to adhere to. Rules, okay, rules to give you a guide, make a correct decision, guidelines. Okay, excellent. Some really good stuff there, guys. Thanks for getting them in there. Something underpinning on pitch actions. I love that, Paul, because that kind of ties into, you know, just a definition that I quite like, which I'll come to in a second here. So, I mean, just some things that you very often hear when you think of principles. You think of values or standards. We have that mentioned above. They provide guidance. Someone has mentioned guidance already. Guidelines. That was Brian Sherry. And awareness. And they govern your behavior. Okay, if you look at Thomas's point up there, way of thinking, behaving, what you stand for in life. That's another kind of definition, if you like, of what principles are. Rules or beliefs. Funnily enough, that just was there towards the end. So Paddy Kay mentioned rules to give you a guide to make a correct decision. So really, really strong stuff, everyone. So thanks for your input there. One definition that I'm really drawn to myself is the definition of principles as a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. So quite wordy. There's a lot in that. But for me, what I like about that definition is it didn't come out of any coaching manual or any academic coaching science or coaching pedagogy paper. Can anyone tell me where that definition came from? Just on a very basic level. If you have an idea, just type it into the text box there. You'll be surprised about its simplicity. Anybody? It actually comes from the Oxford Dictionary, believe it or not. And it just shows you how open a term principles is, because it's not a sport specific term, but yet it can extend to sport. It can extend to all facets of life, family, education, relationships, whatever the case may be. But the reason I particularly was drawn to this definition is, I guess, ultimately the key words that jump out of the definition at me. First of all, truth. For me, if you think of a principle, it's an underlying truth that you really believe. It's almost like a philosophy, but it's your philosophy. It's your truth. And that's why I said at the outset that, you know, just what I present over the next few minutes and share with you all and hopefully have a conversation about it, doesn't mean that that's the only way or that's the right way. It's just my way. And as I said, I have far more principles, you know, than I'll be presenting or sharing with you tonight, but I just wanted to keep it very basic on a certain level. The second aspect of that definition is foundation. And for me, from a principles-based approach to coaching, to my coaching philosophy, I think you really need to have a very clear, very concise foundation, one that you believe in, and as a manager or a coach that you can share with the rest of the management team, the backroom team, and ultimately that you can share with the players and bring the players along with you. Because there's no point in you as a manager or a coach being very principle driven and having a very strong view of what my coaching principles are if the players don't buy it or if they don't buy in. And you really need both of those to go anywhere in any journey that's going to be any level of success. So ultimately is a core foundation that you're establishing your belief system. And for me, in the context of principles in this definition, your belief system relates to almost a culture of the group you're working with, almost to your identity, that everybody is buying in to what these principles are. And everyone is almost adhering to them. They have a shared perspective, a shared agreement with them. Because with this belief becomes a behavior. And it's one thing to believe something, but then to actually act out that belief. That's so critical. And I guess in a coaching and in the sports environment. What that means is taking your discussions, your meetings, your pre-match analysis, your training, but acting on those in a performance environment. And as a good friend and a good mentor has always said to me, Lee Morgan, competition is the best barometer of performance improvement. Okay, so competition, you can be a great trainer, but unless you can actually perform to your best when it matters most, that's really what sport is all about. And that's really what competition and trying to be the best version of yourself that you can be. So it's not just a system of beliefs, it's a behavior as well. And ultimately then at the end, there has to be a purpose. There has to be a purpose. In this definition, if you wouldn't mind just muting. So in this context, that purpose is so important, because if people don't know why they're there, why they're in the room, why they're on the bus, why they're training 3 to 5 nights a week, you know, especially in conditions, not that we're training at the moment, unless you're on a team building session down in Yaw, but if you're actually putting your backs to the wall in really difficult circumstances, that affects family, that affects relationships, that potentially could affect work, there needs to be a purpose, and there needs to be a unified purpose. And that's the chain of reasoning that forms the end of that definition. And it's so simple. It's found in a dictionary, but for me, it means an awful lot, just the words on the slide. So I guess to bring it more into a sport-specific context, your principles ultimately, you know, will be informed and will be responsible for decision-making on the pitch. No more than your principles outside of sport will guide your decisions and your behaviors in other aspects of your life. I like this schematic because it kind of gives options. You know, if you're in possession, this is a potential pathway. If you're not, this is a potential pathway. If you have the ball, if you haven't. And maybe if you just focus on this half here, because if you have just lost possession, ultimately, that means that you are on defense. Okay, you haven't got the ball. So just to follow the tracking here, so green is making its way to its right here. So what are your principles? You deny space, you recover, you get compact. Those to me are principles. They're not telling you how to do it. They're not telling individual players how to do it or what the tactic or the strategy is around that. But they're very clear, they're very concise that if we do not have the ball, our principles are based on a denial of space, a recovery, which to me is a recovery of position or shape, and then establishing a very compact position. How you do that becomes your tactical ploys, but it's your principles that underpin that. And right the way down, are you outnumbered, delay, are you not, pressure, all those different variables, ultimately decision-making, all are derived from what your principles of play are in the first place. So I just like that kind of summative schematic there, because it just makes you think. And I think that maybe we don't do enough of that in coaching at the moment. Of course, it is being done, and there's a variety of coaches who are doing their best to do that. But I just think the coaching models, the coaching systems, coaching programs in the last number of years, number of decades, have been very much prescriptive and very much focused on how to perform a skill. Okay, how to kick a ball over the bar, how to pick the ball up with your dominant foot, non-dominant foot. But very rarely in any coaching courses I've been on over the years has there been a real focus on the why. Okay, so why did you execute a certain skill at a certain time in a certain context? What was the reason behind that? What was your decisioning in that regard? And that to me can be governed by, as I said, by principles. And I suppose the best example I can give you just in recent times for myself, it relates to two terms that you're probably all very familiar with. And they would be terms such as role clarity and role execution. If the principles of play, in this case, principles of defense, are very clear in terms of the theory, so the discussion, but also the behavior and the actions, there should be a clarity of role. And then with the expectation that if there's a clarity of role, the execution should follow. And I suppose the best example I could give you of where this didn't happen, which made me as a coach have to reflect quite significantly, was just a very short championship that I would have been involved this year with Cork, whereby there would have been a very clear role and expectations around role going into a Munster semi-final this year. And with that became a role execution, because we pretty much knew for the number of weeks, even months in preparation for that semi-final match, who would have been available. We had some medium-term injuries, they were out. We had some long-term injuries, they were definitely going to be out. But for the most part, you would have had a 4-week lead-in to prepare for that match. And because of that, the role clarity was locked in. The role execution was the expectation. And the reason there was an expectation is because in those 4 weeks, we were able to tie in and lock down role acceptance, whereby we had time to make sure that people, number one, understood the role, or their role, or the role of a unit, the role of a squad, the role of those in a kick-out strategy, the role of those in defending a kick-out strategy. And the acceptance came through the preparation, through the repetition, through the discussion, through the review, through the analysis. And there was an element of confidence in that, an element of comfort as a coach, as a management team. So when all is going well, these things tend to align themselves quite nicely, quite naturally. However, that changed quite significantly in the 2 weeks after that match, where we picked up a couple of knocks, unfortunate knocks, some in the semi-final, one in training, whereby all of a sudden you have a very short window of opportunity to prepare and plan for your next match, which happens to be a provincial final. It's a big match. And with injuries and with a lack of time, you have a lot of players and a lot of people who are nodding their head and saying, yeah, I get this. And obviously there's an excitement that you're playing in a final. So the expectation is that the role execution is going to follow. But maybe the biggest question that wasn't asked enough, and wasn't asked enough by me, was the role acceptance piece. So when you had someone who's playing a specific role, like a Sean Powter all year, and then you're asking someone relatively inexperienced to play in that role, yes, they're delighted to have that role assigned to them, but had they fully accepted that I'm going to have to change my game relative to how I've been playing or training all year, and accepting that new role? Because without role acceptance, there cannot be role execution. And if that's one player, that's not ideal. If it's 2 or 3 players, well, ultimately that can become problematic. So it's a really big lesson that I would have learned this year, that role clarity in your mind and in their mind is only ever on the pathway to role execution if role acceptance occurs before then. And I don't think conversation is enough in that. That really has to be acted out in specific training preparations, training exercises, a constraints-led approach to your training, a tactical approach to your training. But you need time for that too. But it was a big lesson for me this year. And before I go on any further, and just introduce some fundamental video footage that maybe backs up some of the things that I'd like to share about defensive principles. Just one thing to be clear about principles as opposed to actions. I mean, principles underpin everything we do. They're long-term, they're sustainable, they're a foundation effectively. Actions are things that happen in a moment and in multiple moments across a match. So actions like deny the ball in. I mean, that can't be a principle, because you can't always deny a ball in a given game, or in a given portion of a game, or even in a given specific play within a game. Similarly, deny. Obviously, you want to delay the ball going in from a defensive perspective, because you want to give your defensive structure and your players enough time to set up, to establish the best and the most optimal defensive position. Dispossess, the third of the 4 Ds that I like to use when I'm coaching. So obviously, when you've denied the initial ball in, you're delaying the opposition, then you want to try and take the ball off them. You want to dispossess them. And then while all of this is happening, you're physically, in my mind, and from a claustrophobic perspective, you're trying to dominate them. Dominate them in close contact tackling, dominate them in a spatial perspective in a specific area of the pitch, which we'll see shortly. But all of these things are aspirational. insofar as that we can classify them as principles because they're not always possible all the time, because they happen very much in the moment. And I think that's very clear, and it's why sometimes people mix up tactics, which can change between games, and even for some teams, they can change within games. Basketball is a great example. American football is a great example of where you can employ different tactics in sequential offenses or even defensive systems. If it's zone, it could be 2-1-2, 3-2, 2-3, 1-3-1, whatever the case may be in basketball. There could be 4 different offensive systems or tactics or strategies against 4 different attacks coming at you in a row. But principles are what underline everything you do. And I just think it's important to share that slide in that regard. So for me, when it does come to strategy, when it does come to principles that underline everything, I love this line from the famous American folk singer Woody Guthrie. He said, "Any fool can make something complicated, but it does take a genius to make it simple." And I think in our game, I think we are in danger of overcomplicating things. And even just speaking to Shane, particularly, with our development players, our underage players, our younger players, I really think with solid foundations, fundamental skill development, perform to high levels, which requires practice, obviously, but in constraints-based environments, where they're being challenged to make decisions, challenged to change their mind and learn and reflect on a decision they made. So they might find themselves in the same position in the next task, but they make a different decision, maybe a more correct decision. I think that can be delivered in a very fundamental way from a coaching perspective without making it too complicated. So I'll just exit the presentation here because I just wanted to share just maybe some video clips with you that might highlight some of the key things that I would like to focus on, maybe 3 principles. And they're very simple principles. They're very, very simple principles. So the first principle is the importance of shape. And for me, from a defensive position, I mean, knowing what your defensive shape is, whether it's your flat 3-3 or whether it's the role of a +1. If a team is giving you up a +1, well, then ultimately that's not the greatest challenge defensively. If a team plays 6 forwards up, well, then you need to create a +1 from somewhere. But the importance of shape is really, really, really a big part of my coaching from a defensive perspective. The second principle I want to share with you this evening is the importance of using the sidelines, forcing wide and using the sidelines and even the end lines at times as a 16th man. Okay, so we heard earlier on where someone said staying compact. So similar to staying compact, but even being more specific where you're driving and forcing the opposition wide. So you can use the touchlines and the end line as a 16th man. And then the third principle, just that I'm going to share some video clips with. The third principle relates to how when you haven't got the ball, everybody has a role in defense. Okay, everybody has a role, no matter what that role is. That's where your tactics come in, but that everybody has a responsibility when you are not in possession to play in the role of a defender. So just in terms of the clips, the first 3 clips for me all relate to shape or getting kind of out of shape. And what's disappointing in some of these are that these are foundation principles of the defensive setup that we would have been employing on a very basic level. So if you're 7, you're playing 7. If you're 5, you're playing 5. You're not getting dragged out of position by tracking someone in a man-to-man role. That's really what I'm talking about here, and just the importance of that. So just with the first clip, we have a very specific principle related to how we defend on our own kickouts. So I just wanted to look specifically here on our left half back, on our 7, okay, for the long kick out from our own goalkeeper in this regard. So it looks like that kick wasn't wide enough. That kick came in field. So obviously our midfielder and our 12 were expecting that ball to go towards their right shoulder, towards the sideline. It didn't. So our 7 should be understanding right here and now that we're not going to win that kick out, which means the next position based on our defensive principle of shape for our own kickouts should be to hold a 7 pocket so they can pull the trigger early and get that ball into their full forward line. Lack of thinking, bang. The person that you're seeing there, Seven, and by the way, we've gone all through this in obviously reflection meetings, so it's not about speaking out of turn, it's just about trying to share some thoughts and ideas. Where that ball is now going to be kicked is literally into the position where, based on our principle, our 7 should have been. And there you have it. And even though, and this to me is why principles are critical, even though this is not his man, its principles are not about you doing the best you can do to protect yourself, to make yourself look great. Principles are always, always, always for the team. So by holding shape, sticking to our defensive system, you are helping the team. In this case, you're helping the midfielder or half forward whose man has passed them out. And all of a sudden, you can see the game opening up there. And all because the principle of holding shape in vulnerable positions was not adhered to. So I don't like the word rule, but in some cases, it's actually more appropriate. The rule is, if you do lose your own kick out, make sure we are solid in defense. Similarly here, and there's a good reason for the positional switch here, but I just thought it was a good clip to show, excuse me, related to shape. We have a 12 that's racing all the way back, ultimately from the 12 spot, because you can see Paul Murphy here, 5 for Kerry, who is not even up at the level of play. So what that means is that 12 is busting his gut to get back into position to help where his teammates should have been. And now, because he's busting out, even if that shot wasn't taken, we're still vulnerable coming out on the side here. If that ball was popped back out 5, well, then that's a relatively easy shot. And the problem with this from a shape perspective, a defensive principle, is we have a man cut out of position. We can't see because of the camera angle why, but the principle is the critical thing that hasn't been adhered to here, without getting too deep into it. The last clip in terms of principles relates to the role of a +1. So just so you're very clear here, so the purpose of a +1 is obviously to provide some cover for your full backline players. And when you're playing a team like Kerry, who have exceptional forwards, you know, if they play 6 up, you're in a really difficult position because you need to manufacture a +1 from somewhere, which means you're sacrificing in most cases one of your forwards in order to get someone back into that +1. But the other sacrifice also is that the time it takes to get someone from one half of the pitch down to the other. In this particular match, we were offered a +1, if you like, because of the defensive shape of the opposition. But the principle of a +1 is not about just being back there. The principle of a +1 is that you are always supporting, minding, protecting the most dangerous opponent in that picture at that time. So from a principles perspective, where this is disappointing, is that in this case, we actually have a +2, as you can see. Okay, but the critical thing is there really only is one threat in that forward line. And that one threat is actually the only opponent that's in the full forward line. So instead of having 2 men on a vertical axis here, really covering nothing, because neither of these Kerry players are even interested in the next ball, he's walking out towards his own goal and he has his head down looking at his shoes. However, we have someone who's angling up his body, looking for that pass. The principle is not the fact that you're back there. The principle is that you're back there for a specific reason in a specific context. And that should be to cut out the ball to the most dangerous player. And that's where it's disappointing from a shape perspective. Quick free taken, lack of reaction here. And then ironically, the person who goes to support is a person who's almost the furthest away from the ball. And it's an easy free given in. So just have a look at the reaction again. Just have a look at this particular play here. It's almost a lack of concentration because look at the body language as soon as the ball is kicked in. It's almost like there was a lack of expectation that that ball is going in. Panic, bang. Too late at that stage though. Saw free, but it was given. Excuse me. And now we just want to contrast that. and just to show you exactly how important principles can be. So in this case, wing forward 12 has obviously noticed that we're in trouble here. We're exposed inside because we literally have a 2v2, but we have a 1v1 close into goals. You would think, well, why isn't 12 out here in the wing? This is a judgment call made at that moment in time by number 12 Cork, because he doesn't see his direct opponent as an immediate threat. So the principle of help side defense here is what he's adhering to. Now, maybe a little bit too far across. I don't want to be too critical here, because when you're making split decisions in real time, it can be really tricky to get that perfect position. But you can see exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to cut off, and he's succeeding in cutting off the space directly inside here, and does it really, really well. Forces the carry player to change tact, go back across the pitch, and to be fair, full credit, a brilliantly two-footed player, which is how we should be seeing more of our players these days, spots the fact that 12 is out of position. So maybe as he turned back outfield, Cork 12 should have been shifting a little bit, but nevertheless, the danger was never met by that ball inside from the player. Ball switches across, but it does give time for the defense to realign and get a little bit more shape, a little bit more structure, and no score given. So just an example of the importance of shape of 12 tucking in for 7 when 7 tucks across to help 6. Similarly here, we'll see exactly the same. So if you're looking at where the Kerry half forward is, he's out here. Okay, he's just out of picture at the moment. So what has happened, and this is where shape and a common understanding, because it's principles based, becomes really important, is that 12 knows that 7 needs to tuck in to play help defense. So 12 doesn't stay up on 12. 12 drops back towards the 7 pocket to allow 7 tuck into the center. So if we are breached in the middle, which we are at the moment, 7 is not stuck out here, not playing help defense. 7 is tucked in and is ready to stand up to the tackle as soon as the ball comes in. And that's all based on the principle of help defense. That didn't happen by chance, that 12 dropped back to 7 and 7 tucked into the middle. So the importance of principles and a common understanding is ideal. This is probably the best clip just to show you from having principles are really important, but making critical decisions in real time is what sets players apart. So Cork on an attack here, turned the ball over quite softly in the opposition 45. And all of a sudden you're on the back foot. And you can see here that ground has been lost significantly by the Cork midfielder number 9. So based on our defensive principles of a +1 going into this match, our +1 right now at this time, you can't see because of the camera angle, is sitting in front of the Kerry 2. However, all of a sudden, he realizes that there's no point in me sitting back here and they have a running game coming up. As that ball is in the air, drives forward to make contact, bang with the hard hit, and away you go again. So just to take that back again in real time, he's deciding, do I stay or do I come? He's just decided to come, makes the hit, and away Cork go. So just a really, really important point related to defensive shape, the clarity of role, the acceptance of role, and then the execution of role. 3 clips where we were off point, 3 clips where fellas were executing the plan exactly as they should have been because the principles were sound. The second principle, as I said, I'm just presenting 3 here, very basic, very fundamental, is the principle of forcing the opposition wide and using the sideline as a 16th man. Not always to take the ball off the opposition, like great to get a steal, but in many cases the importance of this is just a delay tactic. It's a delay tactic to allow the help side defense that we just saw in the last 2 or 3 clips to actually function at an optimal level. However, if you're not forcing your opposition wide, if you're getting turned while out on the wing, it can ultimately be very dangerous. Okay, so here we have a Cork 21 in a great position to force the Kerry player wide towards the line or even into contact here with the help player. Okay, comes at the wrong side of the tackle. And not only does he take himself out of the game, you can see that the whole shift from a Kerry attack where you have 3 players running at goal places Cork in a very vulnerable position. And if there was any space here in front, and the ref could have left it go a little bit longer, if we're being honest, that could have been a 20-metre hand pass inside, and it could have been a one-on-one. Why? Because your +1 had to step up once the danger was coming. All because the principle of forcing wide and delaying was not adhered to. Something similar down in the 2 pocket here, where you have the benefit of 2 lines. You have your end line and you have your sideline. Need to be using these very, very specifically and very carefully to allow the help cover. Okay, so 5 to get back into position, 6 to drop back at an angle, midfielders to come back in, and of course your 4 and your 7 help defense from the other side of the pitch. So really what we should be trying to do here is to force, in this case, Balan on a vertical. So we force him up the sideline, so he's literally running back towards the 45, as opposed to giving him an angle to cut in field. And the danger is, once that angle is given, all of a sudden a foul is given, but you're also opening yourself up to an actual goal chance. All because the principles of forcing wide and delaying were not adhered to. Last play, as you can see again, 2 men on the sideline in a position where they could have forced wide. As soon as that ball breaks in, first missed tackle, second missed tackle, third missed tackle. Goal chance, good save by the keeper, should have been a better shot. Let's just take it back to the start on that. This is where the ball needed to be taken care of out on the wing. Because so far as you can see, matching, +1, matching, matching, matching. Big trouble here. Big trouble here. Okay? Ball watching from 5. This is exactly where we should be. Looking too far up the pitch. This is where we need to be when the ball is on the sideline. If this ball was given in here very early, Cork could have been in a really vulnerable position. But it needed to be stopped right there and then, because you have a position to force him towards, if not over, the sideline. First mistake, leaving the ball in field. Second mistake is still not ushering the man away, not staying compact, not ushering him away from the centre channel, which is the most vulnerable channel on the pitch. Missed tackle, missed tackle, missed tackle. And it could have been a goal, crucially. Just this first clip of the 3 where it was in a much better defensive position, adhering to the principles agreed as a squad. This looks easy, and it is relatively easy when it's done correctly, but it's so effective. So obviously Gavin White will be an incredibly strong attacking player down the wing, and would have proved that in previous games, especially in the last 2 games of the league, the last 2 rounds. Cork 10, ushering him to go down the line, but not close enough where he can step inside, and has a body position and body angle whereby if he does, he can simply drop, step and pivot to come into that lane. So he's basically showing him down the line, because that's exactly where he wants him. All of that time, it's giving the Cork defence, particularly the help side defence, time to get back into position. Ultimately down towards the corner, change of tact, Kerry have to head right back around the long way, instead of that strong attacking line up the wing that they were so effective in matches up to that. Similar point here. This is in relating to the delay. So as you can see, no cover here. So the +1 in this case was a little bit too far away. But just looking at the role of the fullback here, knows where the end line is as opposed to the sideline. Delays him to force him back in field. So he's not giving him the baseline, the end line. And that simple contact allows a midfielder to come back into position. And all of a sudden, you're forcing them further out again than they would have been when the attack initially started. So good defending, all because of using the lines. Cheap ball given away here. A couple of hits that were critical just to slow the initial attack. First hit there, second hit there. And now forcing them towards the sideline. 3 hits were given there, which is obviously impactful because it took those 3 players out of the counter-attack. Might have called a tactical fouling, but the ref didn't have his hand up for a free in any case. But it's just the positioning of 14 Cork here in terms of inviting him up the wing, steps in, and then you can see the break from Cork midfielder, forcing him out over the sideline. But even if he did get past that particular tackle, he's still coming into a Cork triangle. If that ball at any stage was being in a position to be passed into the central channel, well, then you potentially could be looking at a goal conceded. So principle 2, force wide and use the 16th man of the sideline, or in some cases of the end line. Just a third principle that I'd like to share with you on a very fundamental level, as I said, and keeping this basic because I don't want it to turn into a tactical conversation. I want to keep it principle based. This first clip all relates to the importance of when you don't have the ball, how everyone has to switch into a defender's mentality. Okay? And no one can be of exception here because all it takes is 1 millisecond of a switch off and danger can happen. And danger sometimes can transfer into goals. Whenever about a point, it can transfer into goals. So just going to draw your attention to the Cork corner forward here, who obviously has done a lot of hard work to get back into a defensive position. Okay. However, just look at the body movements and look at the concentration and the awareness of this particular player when the ball is passed. In his mind, I've done my job because I was just tracking my man and no one else. And all of a sudden, hugely vulnerable. So look at it again. That's my man. If he gets the ball, I'm going to switch on. Wait a minute. He's not going to get the ball. I have a teammate in trouble on the floor. The automatic switch in your mind has to be, I need to help my teammate out here. With the expectation that if I leave my man, one of my other teammates is going to come and help me. But at that moment in time, it was just a lack of concentration, a lack of focus. It can happen with fatigue, but it shouldn't happen. And that half a second has just left that middle channel open. Free given away. And to be honest, it wasn't a bad free to give away considering they had a man up. However, to be fair and to show balance, okay, so would that be, it'll be 7, about 14, 15 minutes later, first half of extra time, same player, similar position, back in, taking a man out and doing what he should be doing as opposed to literally just being a passenger. And the last 5 clips are all related to almost a combination of the principles we've talked about already. So 1 was help defense, 2 was using the line. So there's the sideline. They come back down the end line. There's your teamwork using the lines, and away you come. Everyone is a defender when you don't have the ball. And this is 80, 90 minutes into a match as well. Importance of everybody switching on. So that was a free given from the throw-in. You can see a really good ball inside his bypass 3 or 4 Cork jerseys. From that throw-in, having lost it, the mental switch to all the players in the vicinity to say, we need to get back to where the danger zone is. And all of a sudden you have a 4v1, 4v2. That's the mentality you need to be looking at if one of your core principles from a defensive perspective is when we don't have the ball, everybody becomes a defender. Similar here, dangerous, vulnerable kick out here from the Kerry team. 2 players switch on. And exactly what would have been, okay, that wasn't practiced on in training, not too clever. But it's exactly what would have been practiced upon in training. Role clarity, role acceptance, role execution. Just the last couple of clips, the same thing. The reason I'm drawing your attention to this clip is that this is your number 14. Okay, and at different stages in a match, depending on energy levels or where the ball was turned over in the first place, you just need your forwards, no matter what number you have on your back. And look who's back helping him. Your other inside forward man to get back and help. Because the principle is when we don't have the ball, every one of us are turning into defenders. Simple, but effective. Tactics relates to how you implement that. But the principle is to make sure they have the belief system from the second slide to go at that. Once again, who have we got here? Our number 12, chasing back from the half forward line, and our number 10, who came on as a sub, and they're the ones doing the work, not who you might expect there, a 5. So just some food for thought in terms of trying to give some kind of context to the 3 principles that I wanted to share with you there. If I just flick back into the presentation, just make sure that we're all on the same page with that. Just a quick talk on moving on to tactics there, and I'll finish with that, and we can almost have the discussion about the tactics related to the principles. Everything has to start with the principles at its fundamental basis, and it's not to say that tactics aren't important. I like this image, this quote from Sun Tzu in terms of tactics, because it can feel that way, particularly playing against the best teams. So you might be likened to the Shuai Zhan, which is a snake found in that region of China. You strike at its head, you'll be attacked by its tail. You strike at its tail, you'll be attacked by its head. You try and strike it in the middle, and you'll be attacked by both. Sometimes when you're playing against the top teams, and no matter what the sport is, it can almost feel that way. For me, the safety blanket is that you adhere to your principles. Then it's your specific tactics that try and guide you through how you're going to take on that opposition at that moment in time. And ultimately, tactics are very much a conceptual approach. And it's important because tactics are not definitive. They need to be adaptable. They need to be fluid. They need to be sport specific. That's not to say that they can't be borrowed from other sports and adapted, but also the movement skills need to be appropriate in order to employ those tactics. And very much comes down on a fundamental basis to what's known as the 4 Oars. This is something that came out of teaching games for understanding in a physical education context. From a tactical perspective, you want your players to read the game situation off the ball. You want them to be able to respond with appropriate movement to relocate themselves for the advantage of their team. You want them to react to produce appropriate skill execution. And also you want them to recover with off-the-ball movement to set up further game involvement. That could relate to defensive movement in the context of this evening's presentation, but that recovery could also relate to transition. So if you do turn the opposition off, what is the next position that you need to get your body to? And what is the next skill from your armory of skills that you need to execute? A short hand pass will only get you 10 meters. A distance kick pass might get you 40 meters. But in order to do that, your other teammates need to be able to read the situation, respond, and react. So, I mean, it looks quite complex on paper. Breaking it down into the 4 Oars for me, it doesn't really matter what the sport is. It's developing their understanding and reinforcing that through discussion, through practice, through reflection, through repetition, through further discussion, through practice, and so on and so forth. And it does take time to develop those tactics in terms of whatever set of tactics you're trying to employ. And time between games is really important in that regard, I feel, especially if you have what I would regard as a couple of catastrophic injuries from a tactical perspective that Cork would have had between the 2 matches, because everyone loses players to injury. But if you don't have that many players in specialized roles, for example, if Tampa Bay Buccaneers lost Tom Brady before the Super Bowl, would they have won? You know, if Kansas City had lost Patrick Mahomes, would it have been competitive as a match? So some teams have those type of players. Some teams have greater depth. So it's very much based on the individual team, how you can fluidly move through tactics and tactical approaches. But for me, from a coaching perspective, these are, 5 fundamental guidelines that I think are useful in terms of starting the coaching process. First of all, is identifying the tactical problems and the associated principles of play. So we're back to the start here in terms of what are our principles of play and what are the tactical problems within that. I think the second thing, particularly from a youth coaching perspective, is understanding the level of tactical complexity that is appropriate to the group. And this is the point I was making earlier on about sometimes overcomplicating things. I think principles should be fundamental and foundation in their nature. Tactics have several layers of complexity that you can take them. You just need to be careful from a coaching perspective that you're not employing tactical ploys that your players are not either cognitively or even skill-wise not able to execute. And perhaps one of the mistakes that we would have made is one of the critical roles at our match was choosing a player to adopt that role after the injury of one of our key defensive players, and not having in that moment, with such reduced levels of practice, the ability to modify their game performance, their ability to adapt to the new role placed on them. Practice movements relative to new gameplay devised as a response to the initial tactical problem. So, for example, the movement pattern of transition gameplay is very different to the movement pattern of a slow control build-up. You're looking at vertical lines versus horizontal lines. So, obviously, if you're changing tactics that incorporate changes in movement patterns, well, that's where the integrative approach from your strength conditioning coach, your athletic development coach, whatever you might call them, who you're working with, that's where the integrative coaching practice becomes very, very important. Similarly, if you're working on an attacking ploy and you're moving from a direct style of attacking, particularly with a direct kicking game, which Kerry would have got a lot of success of around the 0-6-7 period, right up to 0-9. But all of a sudden, maybe you don't have that large target-based full forward line, and you're moving into a more movement-based, lateral-based movement pattern, forward movement. Well, then you need the movement skills enabled to play to enable them to play that. The fourth one for me is critical, and this is where empowering players and encouraging players to, to discuss, to reflect upon, to challenge. I think it's really important that they challenge is so important, because ultimately it might be perfect in our minds on a tactics board or, on a bit of footage from a match, but ultimately it will be the players themselves who are executing. Okay, so the role clarity into role acceptance, into role execution, it's critical that you have thinking players out there who have come across multiple adaptations to the tactics you're trying to employ. And then from a teaching perspective, from a coaching perspective, repetition, repetition, repetition. Modify the constraints. Okay, so whatever the constraints may be that you want to put on it, an extra defender, less attacker, one play, no play. Ball has to hit both corners before you can actually score, whatever the case may be. But repeat the opportunities, but providing different challenges, cognitive as well as tactical challenges on the players. That is how you get closer to the strategy, having thinking players, active players, fluid players that you need. And as I said, although principles are critically important as the bedrock for everything that you do, tactics or strategy is absolutely critical. Because as Alvin Toffler said, if you don't have a strategy, unquestionably, you're going to be part of someone else's. Okay, and probably a perfect example here is kick-out strategies in a modern game. So if you know they're going after your long kick, you can't just hedge your bets and keep kicking long and presuming that, we're going to win a higher percentage than them. You need to have modified, adapted strategies so that if you start to go short or if you start to go mid-distance, well, then they have to press up in those pockets. And then all of a sudden, that gives you an affordance to go long again because they're not overloading where they were initially. So that strategy is so, so important. And it all comes back to game planning and game preparation. So just a little bit of take home in terms of the role of teaching. And this came out of, once again, some physical education, teaching literature, but they're relates directly to coaching as well. And it's the importance of using questioning as teaching. So asking the players what you do in a certain situation, how you do it relates to their skilled ability, their movement development ability. When is the best time to do it? So specifically from a support perspective, from a running perspective, where is or where can? Okay, so what space? For me, you're either penetrating space or you're creating space for others. But there's one thing you should never do, and that is to kill space by standing in it. So where is the space and where can you penetrate or where can you move to create space for someone else? And then this is where the decision making comes in, that last point, which choice? I guess it becomes risk reward at that stage. And I suppose Gaelic football in particular, it has become quite risk averse. And maybe it is time for teams to throw caution to the wind a little bit more. I definitely agree with that. Funnily enough, I was reading an article about a brilliant coach, Paul Connerk, who I'm sure you're all aware of, with the Limerick Hurlers and formerly of Clare. But it's just in the article at the weekend there, Paul had mentioned that he probably has brought a bit of that possession stakes kind of tactical approach or strategy to hurling. Some people are not happy with it, the hurling purists, for want of a better term. But for me, it's not that people should be, scowling at that. For me, they need to come up with counter strategies to make sure that Limerick have to think a little bit differently about how they play their game. Because at the moment, they're playing that type of game, that triangle support game, absolutely superbly. So which choice is a really, really interesting question in terms of trying to tactically coach using fundamentals of physical education pedagogy. So just in summary, for me, the only way to develop tactics which are based on your principles, whether it's principles of defense or attack, are through modified games that have to be suitable and relevant to the player's stage of development. Okay? No isolated individual skills practice will ever develop a tactical games approach for a team. And rarely will it even develop that approach on an individual basis. Using a tactical games approach, and you'll notice that I use the term tactical games approach as opposed to small-sided games. I just think, and just from talking to students, here and working in MTU in Cork, or just with other coaches, having chats, I think there's an interchangeable use of small-sided games, game-based approach, tactical games approach, constraints games approach. They're not all the same, because not all games-based approaches are tactical. Sometimes the coach who is actually using a small-sided games approach or a games-based approach may not even know the why behind the what. Whereas tactical games approach, constraints-led approaches to coaching, they're all about the why. They're all about the why and the how before you even get to the what. Okay, and I think that is important because that's where players gain an understanding of the demands of a game. You're trying to train and coach them relative to how you want them to perform, or relative to how the opposition will perform. So I think that is important. If coached effectively using a tactical games approach, a constraints-led approach, it will or it should develop the player's tactical awareness, as well as also trying to hone their skill execution, which is critically important in real time using game-specific scenarios. And it's only then will they start to develop an appropriate awareness, a decision-making awareness about what to do, when to do it, how to do it, but always in the background, why? Why? What was the fundamental underpinning of that decision that was taken? And then ultimately the take-home message, by increasing the level of decision-making, you're constantly challenging the players to become more aware of the chaotic environment that is invasion sports, that is Gaelic football, that is hurling. But you're also exposing them to the different possibilities that can happen in a match, because invasion games, Gaelic games that we all love and have a passion for, no one game is the same. Not all attacks are the same, not all defenses are the same. So I really, really, really do think that it is important that we're exposing players to a variety of possibilities to make them adaptable, to make them fluid, to make them critical thinkers, and to make sure that they don't fear being thrown curveballs in matches at any different stages. It's leading to high decision making. It's helping them to be calmer. So as I like to talk about, being comfortable in uncomfortable situations. The more they do it, it leads to pattern recognition, spatial reasoning. You start to learn the preferred moves. What side do your teammates like to cut off? Visualization is so important. If you have principles and then you further have embedded tactics, well, then you have something concrete to visualize in your planning and preparation. And it can lead to focus and concentration improvements, and even reaction and anticipation, especially from a defensive perspective. So thank you for your time, folks, and good luck to everybody on your coaching journey. I hope you found that somewhat beneficial. Initially, I had no thought about moving on to anything related to tactics, because I do think that can blur the water when, for me, establishing correct bedrock principles are more important. And then you develop your tactics from there. But as I was putting the presentation together, I just thought it might have been stopping short of what people wanted to listen to or hear about if there wasn't some piece about tactics. So I'll just stop sharing my screen there. And if there are any questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat function. That's probably the handiest thing to do, Shane, is it?
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, just type them into the chat box. And thanks very much, Keane. Very thorough presentation. I think everyone really enjoyed it. I see some feedback coming in there. Excellent stuff. So folks, if you have any questions, just type them in. Colin, you any there?
No, I'm fine, Shane. I thought it was very good, Keane. Great explanation between, principles and tactics. So, it's great learning curve. So any questions, I'd get them in. I'm sure the man is keen to answer plenty. Excuse the pun.
Yeah, and I do think that is the most important take home, if there are take homes for people, Colin, because we do a bit of work just through work here in MTU with Cork GA, but through Rebel Oak, which is their development squad pathway, which I know yourself and Shane will be familiar with. And in the earlier workshops, as part of one of our PhD studies, I'd say 2, maybe 3 workshops in, I wasn't involved, one of my PhD students was telling me this, was that a lot of the coaches, the novice coaches, were still struggling. They were confusing principles with tactics. And it took 3 workshops to establish the clarity between the two. A lot of coaches were moving on to tactics and developing strategies, but still couldn't explain or elaborate what are your guiding principles as a coach. So I do think it has to start with principles.
Keane, if you have any issues, just send me that presentation just so we can share it just with the folks tomorrow. Yeah. Absolutely,
Shane. No problem at all. I won't send the video, obviously, if that's okay, but I'll send the presentation.
No hassle. No hassle. There's a question coming in there.
Okay.
How do you handle a player that won't stay still? Do you go man to man, or just let them roam free, or trust your shape?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, because there's no definitive answer to that. I think for me the principles of, if I could just use an example of 12, right? I talk about positions and numbers. I think it's easier. So if, for example, 12 is working laterally across the line and 5 is asking the question, then our own 5, okay, do I follow him? Because if I track him, I'm leaving a big gap in our right half back position. If I don't track him, the chances are he might pick up a softball in 11, and then 6 has to make a decision about what he's going to do. I think you need to look at it in the holistic shape of your team, if you like. What I would say there is 5 would track that player to a certain point, whereby if he goes any further, he's leaving his team exposed, but he's close enough to pass that player off to the opposite midfielder. Okay, the opposite midfielder who potentially can tuck in a little bit to take him, because you're near midfielder. So say in that position, your 8 is your near midfielder. Well, then they're obviously probably caught up with trying to block that channel and that diagonal run in. But your opposite midfielder 9 most likely has an opportunity to tuck in. 7 already should be tucking in. 4 already should be tucking in. And that means that 12 on the opposite side and even 11 can drop back a little. So for me, it's not as simple as you go with them or you stay. I think you need to look at it, Shane, in terms of the fluid kind of interaction between the players. And I always use the imagery of a piece of rope. whereby if one player moves, the player that's next in line. So for example, if 5 in that case is shifting across, he's connected with his right hand to 10 in front of him. And as he starts to shift across, he's pulling 10 back into his position because he's leaving his position. And similarly for 7 and 5 and so on and so forth. So I do think that interaction between 5 and 10, 7 and 12 and the weaks or the help side midfielder, I think that's the best way I can answer that question, to support interaction between them.
Very good. And just another question there from Vincent. What would you recommend to start up the process of values in a team, and how best to empower your players?
For me, the most important thing is to have a conversation, is to ask them. I very often been asked, just even in coaching classes, should it be driven by the players? Should it be driven by the management? I think what's brilliant is to have breakouts, and I know it's really difficult to do it in person now, it's impossible, but even with Zoom now, I do think we have new affordances whereby we can use the technology to have breakout groups, let the players feedback in, either have a separate management backroom and group, or else have a management or backroom member in each group, and then get the players to feedback into what they see as the goals, as their foundation bedrock principles. And I think you'll be surprised by the similarity coming out of every single group in terms of what those core values might be. What's even more exciting is when someone brings up a value that no one else has thought of. And I think that's where facilitation from, be it the manager, the coach, whoever it is, any member of the back room, for the facilitation of that, where you don't just take it and write it up on your flip chart and move on, where you actually unpack that and you ask the individual who came up at that point, where did that come from? Why is it important to you? And all of a sudden that might stoke a fire in someone else, and they'll go, oh yeah, and what about this? And you might actually have a chain reaction whereby the fundamental values of truth, honesty, sacrifice are very quickly being added to by values that maybe no one had thought about in the first instance.
Very good. I think we've 3 more questions here. Would you have any examples of the most basic way to begin developing these defensive principles at underage, say under 15 or under 16?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my earlier slides talked about it being specific and relative and appropriate to age. So what you're not going to want to do in a situation like that is to bring a group of 15, 16-year-olds or younger onto a full-size pitch and start to map out practices that you would do with senior athletes who would cover the same distance in probably 4 or 5 seconds quicker. For me, this is where a tactical games approach becomes very, very useful, whereby if you had a small-sided pitch set up, but with a tactical focus in your game, so say if it is help side support, and you were playing a game of 2-2-2, but you were constantly asking the ball to start down, say, the right wing. So say if the pitch was, just for example, if you're playing between the 2 45-meter lines, okay, which is it's a decent sized pitch. It's about a 55-meter length pitch, and your pitch is 20 meters wide. But one of the constraints is that the play always has to start in one of the corners of the pitch. So either in the right cornerback position or the left cornerback position. Basically, by virtue of the ball starting in one side, that means you already have a default setting for a help side defense by the defensive team on the other side of the pitch. So rather than having 3 players per line, that might be a bit too soon to start that practice, because when the ball gets into the middle, they wouldn't have developed the understanding of help defense because they haven't done it with only 2 players in a row. Does that make sense? And once they understand when the ball goes from the first line to the middle line, and how your right corner forward is tucking back into right midfield, your right midfield is tucking back towards the center line of the pitch, now you're getting it in lines of 2. Now let's make it lines of 3. And all of a sudden you're in lines of 3. You're explaining to the players that these are exactly the same lines that you would find in a pitch. Say if the ball started in right half back position. But you're not doing that from the get-go, because that might be too much too soon. Definitely for 13s, 14s, maybe less so for 15s, 16s. But I do think you need to start it small, in kind of understandable nuggets of challenge, and then gradually, step by step, build it up, Shane.
Very good. Okay, we've two left here. So what age would you put principles and tactics introduced to an underage teams? And then just the final one is, do you have any simple tactical games for getting them to use the sideline or end line as a 16th person?
Yeah, okay, the first question there, for me, principles in the very first session. I think principles govern every single thing, whether it's offensive or defensive, that you as a coach do. Like, they're your principles in the first instance. Obviously, if you're just starting with a group of kids, it's very difficult to sit a group of kids down and talk about values, and principles if they're very, very young children. But when you can talk about are words that we would use in sport, but they probably have not yet connected the words to sport. So you think of how they would use words like support play, words like communication, words like teamwork. These are words that they probably hear in school and school PE, with family and friends every day of the week. So you use language that's very familiar to them, but still have an impact on sport. It's only when they get older and they really start to understand what those words mean in a sporting context that they might connect it to a more complex tactical strategy. But at a basic level, for me, the principles of space, so that's width and depth, they're critical in terms of principles of attack. In defense, the principles of support, the principles of communication, for me, they should be introduced in the very first session. I think tactics can actually be developed over time without the word tactics ever being used in a child-based setting. I think once you get into a term like tactics for children, especially young children, it becomes too complex, and it almost it's something that's been forced upon them. The focus should still be on enjoyment. And I do think that's critically important. The second question there in relation to tactical games for getting teams to use the sideline as a 16 person. Yeah, very, very similar to what I would have mentioned with the basic game for kids. For me, if the ball is always, if you're setting up any attacking play, so say, I think it's position specific is really important. So therefore, I would have a player in as a fullback perhaps, and I would have a player in number 4 as a left cornerback, have a 6, have a centre back, and have a 7 as your left half back. And the ball starts in the corner, and you have your 13, you have your 14, you have your 10, you have your 11. And basically, the pitch is literally from, say, the width of the goalpost, right? So the near goalpost to the sideline. And the purpose of the game is that they are not allowed to pass 2 lines. They're not allowed to pass the line that gets them past the goalpost, which means you're constantly keeping them wide. And obviously, they're not allowed to pass the line that's the 45, because that means they've just scored a goal, a try, whatever you want to catch, depending on what the game is. And perhaps start that where it's a 4v6, right? Where you have 4 defenders who actually are attackers, and you have 4 attackers trying to work the ball out, but they're wearing defensive numbers. But you have 6 players trying to keep them in, trying to force them over the end line, over the sideline. And see how that develops. If the team of 4 are still getting over the line, okay, that's not great, let's be honest. So instead of chastising them, maybe introduce a 7th player. And then as they start to get success, ask them why they're achieving with the 7th player. Then pull the 7th player out. See how they get on with the 6v4. When they're doing well with the 6v4, well, then pull out a player, and all of a sudden it's a 5v4. So you're starting to make it closer and closer and closer to actual match practice. And I would literally do it in the areas of the pitch, because that to me makes it ecologically valid to use that that sports science term. And I don't like using them generally, with a big audience. But you want them to feel like they're 4 and they've just got a ball that they've saved from going over the sideline, and they're trying to break out. You want the fullback to feel like he's in position and he's giving a support option. You want your 7 and your 6 to be running back towards the ball to try and help their teammates. So I would design practices based on exactly the situations that you find yourself in the game. And the example I gave there, Shane, was the constraint of extra players. and then slowly reduce that constraint bit by bit.
Yeah. Okay, just one more in there. So what are the attacking principles you promote to counter or help side defenses?
Okay, very good. For me, the term that I tend to use is patience with pace with penetration. And for me, that's a principle. That's an attacking principle I have. And I suppose where the patience and penetration have come from was making mistakes over the years by coaching players to be patient against mass defenses. Because ultimately what was happening was they equated being patient to moving the ball at a snail's pace. And by moving the ball slowly, they were never shifting the opposition defense. They were never moving them into uncomfortable positions. So just by reflecting and realizing I'm not doing a good enough job here and this isn't as good as it should be, well, then I started to think, well, I want them to move the ball faster. So it became patient with pace. So all of a sudden, the ball is moving faster, which means that the defense have to shift faster. And you're hoping that by shifting faster, you're going to pick out little holes, little gaps that you can penetrate. And that's what led me to the third part of that, which really I only started using in the last couple of years, which just shows you, like, you know, I was probably coaching 13 or 14 years at intercounty level before in my own head I said the penetration is missing here. And now it's a term that I use all the time. It's a principle that the players are aware of. Patience with pace with penetration, that I want you to make a hard run looking for that ball. And even if you don't get it, you still penetrate the heart of the defense. So you're going to bring one of those cover players with you and you penetrate right out the other side. And for that next pass to two passes, we hopefully with the speed of ball movement have created a hole where that defender is just left to chase the penetrating player through. So it just goes to show you, I was doing it a long time before I even got to that, and yet it sounds so basic. I'm saying, Jesus, am I stupid? Why didn't I do this 5 years ago? It just hadn't come to me 5 years ago, and I just hadn't reflected enough as a coach. So that's an example. I do think it's important to stretch. I don't think teams stretch fast defenses enough. I think if you keep playing around the edges, which was the biggest disappointment of our defeat against Tipperary in the Munster final, we never threatened them. We never penetrated. We played around the edges. We played with fear, which was really disappointing considering we had the highest goal scoring tally in all four divisions in the league. So it was a really curious one and really disappointing for management and players alike. We didn't stretch them, which meant we didn't look for gaps to allow us to penetrate. And I think that's probably the most important thing.
Okay, Cian, that's we'll wrap it up there. Excellent stuff. I think the 130 or 40 that we had logged in, we find it very beneficial. Thanks very much for taking the call and the effort you put into the presentation, and thanks for calling for organising to get yourself. Best of luck for the rest of the year. Obviously, it's strange times, and stay safe. To everyone, to Colin, to Cian, to everyone that's logged in tonight, and hopefully see you again in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone.
No bother, Cian. Thanks a million. Thank you. It was excellent.
Take care.